Okay, let's set the scene. It's 1216. Think Newark Castle, this imposing stone fortress, but inside, it's all heat and horror. You're supposed to be the absolute ruler of England, King John, but instead you're lying there paralyzed by pain, sweating, maybe hallucinating, your own body just completely revolting against you.
It is the ultimate humiliation, isn't it? You've got arguably the most feared, maybe the most hated king in English history, reduced to this spectacle of suffering.
Yeah.
King John, the man who ordered children's scarves, supposedly murdered his own nephew. He's not dying in some glorious battle. He's dying from this relentless, explosive disease. His dignity, the majesty of the crown, it's all just dissolving into filth, frankly.
And that contrast, that's what immediately grabs me. This deep dive, it's really about tracing those last desperate days. We're looking at his final campaign, which was fueled by sheer desperation. Then this catastrophic loss that just shattered his morale, and finally this really undignified death that bizarrely ends up saving his dynasty.
It does.
And in this huge historical twist, it paves the way for constitutional monarchy. So we're not just recounting a death, right? We're looking at how a biological failure essentially reshaped English political history.
It's a classic case, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where the historical outcome is completely different from what everyone expected at the time. Outside Newark Castle, England's torn apart, rebel barons, they've got Prince Louis backing them up. They think John's death means victory, the end of the Plantagenets.
Right.
But they couldn't be more wrong. This death, the specific death, it sets off a chain reaction. It stabilizes the kingdom almost immediately, saves the throne for John's young son, and actually forces the very laws John hated into becoming permanent.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole journey. We need to start with the man himself, King John, and the desperate situation he was in when he died.
Well, he died with the label most hated king in English history, and that really stuck for centuries. We have to understand this hatred wasn't just like political disagreement. It came from a pattern of pretty unique cruelty and personal vice, even when you consider the brutal standards of the Angevin kings.
Yeah, when we talk about Angem to tyranny, we mean that sort of centralized, often ruthless power that he inherited from his father, Henry II. But John seemed to amplify it with his own personal vindictiveness. How much should we trust those chroniclers when they're describing his cruelty? They had their own axes to grind, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Medieval chroniclers, especially monks writing in monasteries John had plundered, definitely had strong moral agendas. But the consensus on John's character, it's damning. And it's consistent across different sources. The stories are often detailed and frankly horrific. The one that always comes up, the one that shocked even people back then, was the case of Matilda de Braose and her son.
That story is just chilling.
It really is. Matilda's husband, William, he was this powerful lord, owed John a huge debt. John demanded hostages, as kings did, but Matilda famously said something like she wouldn't trust her son to a king who'd murdered his own nephew.
Woof. Brave, but maybe not wise.
Not wise at all. John's reaction was swift and awful. He captured Matilda and her eldest son, Hugh, had them walled up, alive, in the dungeon of Corfe Castle.
Walled up?
Yes, just left there to starve to death. The chronicles even report finding their bodies later. Apparently, Matilda had tried to eat flesh from her son's face in a desperate attempt to survive. This wasn't, military strategy. This was sadistic personal revenge.
And it wasn't just political rivals, was it? There were these constant breaches of noble custom, especially involving women.
Indeed. The sources often mention John demanding noble wives and daughters be brought to his bed. Now, even in feudal society, that wasn't acceptable. It was a gross violation of honor, of property rights. It directly fueled the baron's paranoia. If the king could violate your wife, what couldn't he do?
And then the ultimate crime, at least in the eyes of many, the murder of Arthur of Brittany. His nephew, a rival for the throne. The account suggests John killed him with his bare hands.
That's the story from chroniclers like Ralph of Coggeshall. Murdered him in Rouen, weighted the body with a stone, dumped him in the River Seine. Whether it's literal fact or political myth, the belief that John was a kinslayer, that he killed his own nephew, it cemented him as this villain figure, both in God's eyes and man's.
And that belief, that gave moral justification for the Civil War that really defines his last couple of years. So the backdrop to his death is just brutal, total war.
Absolutely. By spring 1216, the barons, they'd had enough. They actively betrayed the Plantagenet line. They invited Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, John's great rival, to come over and take the English throne.
How serious was that invasion? Was this just a minor rebellion, or was the dynasty genuinely about to fall?
It was an existential threat, no question. Louis landed in May 1216. London immediately hailed him as king. Within months, like half the kingdom was under rebel and French control. John was basically fighting this scorched earth campaign across the bits he still held, relying massively on expensive foreign mercenaries.
And his tactics in that campaign were, well, predictably horrifying. Just more cruelty that probably hardened the rebels' resolve.
Pure vengeance. After retaking Worcester, he ordered every single rebel defender hanged. Hanged until, as one chronicler grimly put it, the ravens grew fat on English flesh.
Grim.
Or at Rochester, after a long siege, which was actually a big win for John, he had captured prisoners catapulted over the walls. His mercenaries, these Brabançons, Poisans, they just left this trail of burned villages, random violence, sexual assault. John clearly believed terror was his only weapon left.
But terror is expensive, and that brings us to the core problem driving these final days. Money. By autumn 1216, the cruelty had maybe reached its limit, but the treasury definitely had.
That's the pivot point, exactly. The constant drain of the Civil War, paying thousands of mercenaries, buying supplies, it had just emptied the royal coffers. John had spent his whole reign piling up wealth through taxes, selling offices, looting monasteries,
Right.
and now it was gone. His remaining supporters, especially those mercenaries, they were only loyal as long as the gold kept flowing. So John desperately needed resources. His final, frantic movements were all about grabbing whatever wealth he could squeeze out of East Anglia. That need for speed, driven by his empty wallet, is what sends him towards disaster at the Wash.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it, that we can trace this whole final collapse back to one single document, Magna Carta, sealed at Runnymede, June 15th, 1215. It was meant to be a peace treaty, but it just kicked off the final brutal phase of his reign.
Magna Carta was never, ever intended by John to be permanent. It was a tactical retreat,
Yeah.
a humiliating piece of paper forced on him. The moment he sealed it, literally, he started plotting how to get rid of it. And that really shows John's fundamental flaw. He just couldn't accept any limit on his absolute power.
And he didn't just ignore it. He actually used his connection with the Pope to have it completely canceled. How did he swing that politically?
Well, back in 1213, John had cleverly made himself a papal vassal. This was to settle a long fight he'd had with the church. And that alliance turned out to be incredibly useful. He appealed to his overlord, Pope Innocent III, basically saying, look, this charter was signed under duress, it wrecks royal authority, and you, as Pope, have to uphold that authority.
And Pope Innocent agreed, using some pretty strong language, I recall.
Oh, absolutely unequivocal language. Within just 10 weeks, the Pope declared the charter shameful and demeaning, illegal and unjust, and null and void of all validity forever. This wasn't just, like, a political opinion. It was a religious decree. The Pope actually forbade John or any future king from ever observing it.
Wow.
Which effectively gave the official green light to the Civil War. The barons, now branded rebels against both the king and the church, they had nothing left to lose. That's when they formally invited Prince Louis over from France.
So fast forward a year, and we find John on this last frantic campaign. He rides into King's Lynn, that was called Bishop's Lynn then, on October 9th, 1216. What was he doing there?
Consolidation and extraction, basically. Lynn was a rich port town. John needed to squeeze every last penny out of its merchants, its monasteries, to pay his troops. He arrived like a conquering hero, but only because the locals were forced to put on a show, greet him with fake celebrations, and hand over substantial amounts of silver. John saw this temporary cash injection as his last chance, maybe to turn the war around.
And that very night, the political desperation and the physical destruction sort of converge at the dinner table.
Indeed. John, totally exhausted, stressed out, but maybe momentarily cheered by this influx of cash, he feasted excessively. The sources talk about this huge banquet piled high with roasted meats, fresh bread, rich, heavy Gascon wine. He just gorged himself like a man who hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. One chronicler said he ate enough food for 3 men.
And this feast, this moment of reckless indulgence, was the point of no return, biologically speaking. What exactly was the threat he encountered there?
It was almost certainly severe bacterial dysentery, likely contracted from contaminated food, or probably more likely, the town's water supply. Bishop's Lynn was packed with thousands of soldiers, putting immense strain on sanitation. Heavy autumn rains would have washed human and animal waste straight into the wells or water sources. John, already tired, stressed, his resistance low, ingested these microscopic agents, as we'd call them now, that would just destroy his intestinal lining.
But the medieval mind couldn't see bacteria. They needed a more morally satisfying explanation for why the king was suddenly suffering so terribly.
Exactly. And that's why the chroniclers later settled on the idea of gluttony. Roger of Wendover, who's one of our main sources for this, he doesn't blame the water. He blames John's pernicious gluttony from eating too many fresh peaches and drinking new cider at the next stop, Swineshead Abbey.
Ah, the peaches and cider story?
Right. It served a clear moral purpose. The king's own excess was being punished by God. It turned his awful suffering into a lesson for all tyrants. It made his death seem like this just inevitable consequence of a sinful life.
Okay, so the day after that disastrous feast, October 12th, Jake is probably already feeling a bit off, maybe just mild stomach cramps. But he's driven by panic, he's short on time, and this leads him to make this colossal mistake, the decision to cross the Wash.
Impatience and greed, pure and simple. The safer route, going all the way around the Great Estuary. That would take days. It would expose him to French raiding parties, slow down his march to Newark, where he needed to regroup. So John chose the direct route straight across the mudflats and tidal channels. He thought he could save a huge amount of time. He was basically betting against nature.
So he splits his forces. John himself rides north quickly, small escort, keeping to the higher, safer ground. But he sends the really vital stuff, his entire portable wealth, with the baggage train, taking that incredibly treacherous route below.
It was such a desperate gamble. It really reflects how urgently he needed that cash. That baggage train wasn't just carrying gold coins. It was his whole financial ability to keep the war going. It was all the accumulated plunder, the jewels, the silver plate, the hard currency he needed to pay those foreign mercenaries who were pretty much his last line of defense. If he lost that gold, he lost the war. Simple as that.
Let's talk about the specific value here, because we're not just talking coins, are we? This is centuries of Plantagenet history packed onto those wagons.
Exactly. The inventory that was likely lost is just staggering. It included the crown jewels, maybe not the ancient St. Edward's coronation crown that was usually kept safe in Westminster, but certainly ceremonial state regalia. We're talking 2 complete sets: jeweled swords, scepters, magnificent gold rings, and most famously, the German crown of Empress Matilda, John's grandmother. A huge, ornate piece of German gold work that was apparently in the train. These weren't just pretty objects. They were the talismans of kingship, the physical symbols that backed up the Plantagenet claim to rule by divine right.
So losing the crown jewels and the regalia wasn't just a financial catastrophe, it was psychological, political too. It stripped him of the physical proof of his status.
It was losing the whole theater of kingship, exactly. Without those objects, John becomes functionally just another warlord, not a divinely chosen monarch. And the Wash itself, well, it was perfectly designed to punish that kind of arrogance. It's this vast estuary. Roger of Wendover calls it Weller Stream, just a maze of quicksands, shifting channels, mud flats that are only passable at the lowest tides.
And the logistics of moving a medieval baggage train, heavy wagons, slow oxen, it was inherently risky, even without the tide. What actually went wrong that morning, October 12th?
Most sources point to miscalculation. Either the guides they hired to lead the train across the safest path misjudged the tide, or maybe the sheer weight of the wagons just slowed them down too much. The tide in the Wash doesn't just creep in gently. It rushes in with incredible speed, driven by several rivers meeting the North Sea.
And the sources describe the result as just total annihilation.
They do. The heavy wagons, loaded down with gold, silver, maybe armor too, they just sank into the soft mud or got trapped in unexpected deep channels. Wendover describes it with this stark finality. The ground was opened in the midst of the waves and bottomless whirlpools, which swallowed them all up with the men and the horses, so that not one foot soldier escaped to announce the disaster to the king.
Not one, wow.
It was a total sudden wipeout. John's entire war chest and all his royal symbols gone in an instant.
And John himself rides on completely unaware, reaches Swineshead Abbey safely. When the news finally catches up with him, brought by the few terrified stragglers who took the safer route, what's the immediate impact on him?
Utterly devastating. The chroniclers specifically note that John was seized with such grief of mind, basically shock and despair, that it immediately triggered sharp fevers and grievous sickness. Now, while the dysentery was definitely already brewing inside him, the shock, the sudden, awful realization that he'd just lost the war in a muddy, watery grave that likely precipitated the violent, full-blown onset of the disease. He'd lost the money to pay his troops. He'd lost the symbols needed to project his authority. The defeat was total, really, even before he actually died.
So that night, October 12th, sheltering in Swineshead Abbey, the physical rebellion against John really begins. The shock just pours fuel on the fire of the infection already taking hold. How did the illness progress from there?
It accelerated rapidly. What might have started as mild cramps turned into these agonizing, violent episodes. By dawn the next day, October 13th, John was running a high fever, severely dehydrated, and suffering from this relentless, violent rebellion of his bowels, as the chroniclers put it. He wasn't just losing control of his kingdom, he was losing control of his own body in the most humiliating way.
And yet, despite being obviously terribly ill, despite the monks and his advisors surely telling him to stay put, he insisted on writing. Why push on to Newark Castle?
It really speaks to his almost pathological need for control and just how desperate the political situation was. Newark Castle was a secure, loyal fortress. It was a place where he intended to make one last stand, maybe muster his remaining forces or at the very least die within strong, loyal walls. He simply refused to admit defeat, even then.
So that ride to Newark on October 13th must have been just unimaginable agony, every jolt of the horse.
Oh, it must have been horrific. He could barely stay in the saddle, apparently riding hunched over, having to stop frequently. By the time they finally got him to Newark, he was barely conscious, consumed by fever, and profoundly dehydrated. The dysentery, which is fundamentally just a bacterial infection, was turning the king's insides into this horrific, high-intensity battlefield.
And the royal chamber at Newark becomes the stage for medieval medical helplessness. Master Peter, the royal physician, what did he actually try to do, and why was it so completely ineffective?
Well, medieval medicine was all about the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. They saw John's fever and digestive chaos as an imbalance, probably too much heat or corrupted bile. So Master Peter's immediate reaction was standard practice: repeated bloodletting, trying to drain out the bad stuff.
Which, given the dehydration from dysentery, would have just made things so much worse.
Exactly. Bloodletting, purging. Combined with the massive fluid loss he was already experiencing, it was catastrophic for his hydration levels. They also gave him herbal tinctures, but many of those contained strong irritants, which likely just made the cramping and intestinal distress even worse. Their actions, though they thought they were helping, actually accelerated the systemic collapse of the king's body. They were essentially fighting an invisible enemy bacteria with theories based on philosophical balance. It was futile.
And as we touched on, the chroniclers watching this helplessness, they needed that moral explanation. How deeply did that narrative of divine judgment sink into the accounts of his death?
Oh, it was pervasive. The idea that this monster of a king was just killed by a common bug, that was almost unacceptable. Blaming it on the peaches and cider, or later, that myth about being poisoned by a monk at Swine's Head.
Right.
That allowed them to frame his grotesque suffering as perfectly fitting for his life of cruelty and excess. It gave a kind of moral clarity to the whole messy, awful business. His suffering became a direct punishment from God.
The irony of this absolute ruler failing so completely, so physically, is just unavoidable.
Absolutely. The king, who demanded total obedience from everyone, from lords to bishops, was now completely powerless against the rebellion within his own gut. The sources are pretty blunt about the physical reality. His dignity just dissolved in, quote, rivers of bloody excrement. His attendants, forced to clean up after these explosive episodes, must have viewed him with barely hidden disgust. John was dying as a stark warning, really. Even divinely anointed power is ultimately subject to the frailties of mortal flesh.
It's quite something that despite the incredible pain, the delirium, the constant physical distress, John still had moments of lucidity. He was actually trying to conduct business from his deathbed.
He was.
Yeah.
He was desperately trying to ensure the crown passed smoothly, knowing that any gap in authority would hand victory straight to Prince Louis. So yeah, he dictated letters, issued orders, tried to shore up what little loyalty he had left, but the effect must have been minimal. I mean, the gold was gone. The stench of sickness filled the room. His voice, even on paper, probably lacked any real conviction by then.
But in one of those last coherent moments, he made this really remarkable, quite pragmatic decision, something that went against the usual gender roles of the time.
Yes, the appointment of Nicola de la Haye as Sheriff of Lincolnshire. This was a critical job. Lincoln Castle was under siege by rebels and the French, and Nicola, this elderly but incredibly fierce noblewoman, was holding it for him against overwhelming odds. Recognizing her competence, her absolute loyalty in that moment of crisis, John formally appointed her sheriff.
A woman as sheriff in 1216.
Astonishing, really. Holding the highest royal administrative authority in a whole county. It shows a final flash, perhaps, of John's pragmatic side, valuing sheer effectiveness over convention, when his back was truly against the wall.
As his body continued to fail, spiritual matters obviously became urgent. Around October 17th, the abbot of Croston, a Cistercian monk, was summoned to Newark for the final confession. That must have been an incredibly intense scene.
Oh, you have to imagine the atmosphere. The king, burning with fever, struggling for breath, whispering in Latin between spasms, surrounded by the foul air of his illness. And outside, probably the storm clouds gathering, both literally and politically. The abbot faced this immense task, cataloging the sins of a lifetime. Not just everyday sins, but the huge specific crimes that had defined John's entire reign.
We can only guess at the full list, but it must have been extraordinary.
It would surely have covered the murder of Arthur Regicide, essentially. The deliberate starvation of hostages like Matilda de Brose, countless acts of adultery, broken oaths, theft from the church, murders carried out on his orders. While the chroniclers like to paint a picture of sincere repentance, the reality was probably a complex mess of genuine spiritual terror, maybe some real remorse, but also delirium and desperate bargaining from a man whose body was shutting down. He needed absolution to face the God he'd spent 50 years defying.
And recognizing the end was very near, John dictated his last will and testament on October 18th. This is a really important document in English history, isn't it? And it was also a final, calculated political move.
It's the oldest surviving English royal will, yes. In terms of content, a lot of it was standard charitable bequests, instructions for his soul. But the political mechanism he set up was clever. He deliberately cut out the secular lords, the ones who'd rebelled, from any real power after his death. Instead, he entrusted his 9-year-old son, Henry, and the whole future of the kingdom to a council of 13 executors.
And who he chose to lead that council was absolutely key.
It was the ultimate necessary act of defiance, really. He put the papal legate, Quale Bicchieri, in charge. By handing his legacy over to the Pope's personal representative in England, John ensured that the immense political and spiritual weight of the Church would immediately shield his young son.
Smart.
It was designed to split the rebel coalition. Many of those barons were devout Catholics. How could they keep fighting a war against a child king who was under the direct protection of the Pope's legate? It was a masterstroke, born of desperation.
He also had to change his burial plans, didn't he, because of the war?
Right. His original plan was Beaulieu Abbey, which he'd actually founded, ironically, as penance for Thomas Becket's murder. But Beaulieu was too close to rebel territory, so he chose Worcester Cathedral instead. Much safer, strategically. And he specifically asked to be buried before the tomb of St. Wulfstan, the last Anglo-Saxon bishop.
An interesting choice, connecting himself to an English saint.
A deliberate one, I think. Seeking sanctuary, maybe spiritual protection, alongside this figure from England's pre-Norman past. His last recorded words, according to some accounts, were this humble plea. To God and St. Wulfstan I commend my body and soul. Simple, desperate.
And then, that evening, the end finally came.
Yes. A massive thunderstorm was raging outside Newark Castle, a classic medieval omen, signaling the death of a great controversial figure. Quale Bicchieri administered the last rites, the host, the holy oil. John's final coherent words were that plea for mercy. He died on October 18th, 1216. And the final grim detail reported by the chroniclers is that the violent spasms, the rebellion of his bowels, continued even after he lost consciousness. The disease had the final violent word over the tyrant king.
The second King John died. The whole direction of the English Civil War just flipped. And maybe more importantly, the fate of that French invasion was sealed. How did his death immediately change the politics on the ground?
It created an instant rallying point for the English side. Think about it. The English nobles who'd backed Prince Louis, they mostly did it because they hated John, the man. They didn't necessarily hate the Plantagenet crown itself. Suddenly, the enemy wasn't John anymore. It was this innocent, 9-year-old, anointed English child, Henry III, who was now under the formidable protection of the Church via the papal legate.
And they moved quickly to crown Henry III. That coronation, though makeshift, was a brilliant piece of political theater by those executors John appointed.
Absolutely crucial. Within weeks, young Henry was crowned at Gloucester Cathedral. They couldn't use the proper crowns. Of course, they were somewhere at the bottom of the wash.
Right.
So William Marshall, the greatest knight of the age, this elderly statesman of immense integrity, apparently used his wife's gold circlet, or maybe just a simple band of gold, for the ceremony. John's will had elevated Marshall to the vital role of regent, protector of the young king and the realm.
And Marshall's leadership, that was the real game changer, wasn't it? John's catastrophic failure was immediately followed by this moment of supreme competence.
Marshall was universally respected, even by many of the rebels. He immediately went about unifying the country, but not through John's terror tactics. He used reconciliation, negotiation, legal reassurance. He offered a genuine English alternative to French rule. And crucially, he managed to win over key rebel lords by promising them justice, and most importantly, by reissuing Magna Carta in the young king's name.
Wow.
The political coalition supporting Prince Louis just fractured almost overnight. English nobles chose an English child, English law, and William Marshal over a French conqueror.
So the very document John went to war to destroy becomes the foundation of the new government, all thanks to his death. Let's dig into that a bit. The Magna Carta they reissued in 1216, and again in 1217, it wasn't exactly the same as the 1215 Runnymede version, was it?
No, it wasn't. The 1215 Charter was essentially a wartime truce document, a long list, 63 clauses of very specific feudal grievances forced on a defeated king. The versions reissued by Marshal's Regency Council, especially the 1217 one, were fundamentally different. They were issued not as a concession under duress, but as a foundational act of good governance. They took out some of the most politically charged clauses, like one allowing barons to wage war on the king if he broke the charter.
Okay.
But they cemented the core legal principles: due process, limits on taxation, protection for the church, things that had broader appeal.
And didn't they split it into two documents around then?
That's right, in 1217. That was another smart move. They separated the main legal provisions into the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and created a second, separate charter of the forest. This dealt with all the thorny issues around the royal forests, which affected lots of people economically. By hiving those off, they made the main Magna Carta shorter, more focused purely on law, and therefore much more acceptable to everyone. That 1217 version, slightly revised again in 1225, is the one that became permanent English law and eventually got exported around the world. John's death allowed Marshal to transform John's personal failure into England's constitutional bedrock.
Amazing. Let's quickly touch on the myth that grew up around his death, the story that he was poisoned by a monk at Swineshead Abbey. Why did that story stick around for so long?
It really tells you everything about the sheer hatred he inspired. People in the 13th, 14th centuries, they just found it hard to accept that this king who caused so much chaos, who lived this life of such excess, just succumbed to a common illness like dysentery. Poison felt more dramatic, cleaner somehow. It provided agency. It suggested someone somewhere had deliberately administered justice, maybe divine justice. The reality, severe dysentery leading to dehydration and intestinal failure, was far more mundane, biologically speaking, but also far more humiliating and agonizing for the king himself.
And what about his actual end? The tomb inscription at Worcester tries to put a positive spin on it.
It does. The inscription reads something like, "In this tomb lies the image of a king who in dying brought much peace to the world." It's a remarkable bit of political spin, isn't it? Basically acknowledging that his greatest contribution to England was, well, dying.
Brutal honesty.
And when they examined his skeleton centuries later in 1797, it just confirmed his basic humanity. He was about 5'6.5" tall. All that power, all that cruelty, all that wealth, just reduced to ordinary human bones. Death really was the great equalizer.
And finally, that immense treasure, the crown jewels, the regalia, all the plunder lost in the wash, ever found.
Never. Despite centuries of legends, treasure hunts, even modern tech like metal detectors scanning the area, nothing. The king's treasure, the symbols of his earthly power, remain hidden. The wash is this incredibly dynamic, shifting estuary. The gold, the jewels, they were likely buried deep under layers of silt, quicksand, constantly moving channels. It's almost perfect poetic justice, isn't it? The king who refused to be bound by law was ultimately defeated by a force he couldn't control at all, the simple, relentless tides of nature. John's whole life, spent grasping for absolute power, ended in total helplessness. His death wasn't defined by glory, but by the humiliating reality of a common violent illness. His personal failure, ironically, created the space for a constitutional success.
An incredible story, an incredible end. The French invasion collapses, the barons come back into the fold, and John's young son becomes king under this capable regent, William Marshal, who champions the very laws John despised.
Which really leads us to a powerful question, something for you, the listener, to think about. Historians, we often focus on the winners, right? The successful monarchs who build things. But maybe, was King John's catastrophic reign, his truly undignified death, actually the necessary disaster that allowed England to pivot, to transition from that aggressive, personalized Angevin rule towards something like a constitutional state? What great positive changes in history, perhaps, are only really possible because of the sheer, undeniable failure of the person who came before.